Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about development departments and decision making. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, do you think that development departments should have weekly forums where the developers can mutually discuss decisions before taking them? Yes, I think that's a generally good idea. All the, well, not all of, but most of the times that I've worked with different software teams, the thing that we do is to have so-called retrospectives. Now, it's a little bit important to just distinguish between like a retro and this forum type of thing. The common thing, depending on how you're working now, if let's say for the sake of argument that you're in a company that uses cross-functional teams, then it's very common that your retrospective is more of a, well, everybody's kind of included, and that means that non-technical stakeholders like sales or POs or so forth, they might actually, or QAs, they might be in the discussion. And in my experience, although that's very useful from the perspective of like social things and like talking about collaboration and stuff like that, it's not really the thing where you get really nerdy about or in depth into different decisions you want to make in the code base. So having a specific retro where you kind of reflect, if let's call it a forum, is a very useful thing. Now, the thing I want to touch on though is that these forums, although they're very useful and like knowledge share and you can do all these sorts of things, they're a little bit forced sometimes. What I mean by that is basically that I'm gonna get a little bit personal here. So I have on many occasions criticized the what I like to call the average IT manager for this very specific thing, where the average CTO or the average IT manager, middle manager, or whatever, and this is just a trick. Please, guys, be more than this person, but I will give you this tip anyway. If you want to impress the average technical manager, waste everybody's time by holding presentations and learning initiatives about stuff that literally every single person in the room already knows, apart from the manager, of course, or they could Google in less than a second. Convert what should be a post on a few useful articles to an entire meeting. It makes you look really good, but at the same time it wastes a lot of people's time. But the average technical manager has no way of distinguishing between when this is useful and when it's not useful. So like that's one of those things that for some reason we talk about having too many meetings and we should get as much as possible out of our developers and the meetings that we do have, yet for some reason it's really tricky for the average IT manager to figure out when they're wasting people's time and when they're actually contributing in a meaningful way. These forums, I argue, they're useful if you have, let's say, collaboration between design and engineering or QA and engineering, and they should ideally, in my experience, this is what works best, be something that is a scheduled meeting for every week, but before the meeting someone, ideally the tech lead or the team manager or whatever, posts the question, does anybody have anything specific to talk about? If you do not, skip the meeting. Because it is complete bullshit, like it's complete waste to have a bunch of people sitting on a meeting every week where they might not have something significant to talk about. And sure, you can absolutely, you don't want to get into a point where nobody ever shares anything, because then the whole thing is kind of pointless. And you don't want to scare people or put them in a situation where they don't talk about things. But there's a different way to solve that I think is much more efficient, and it's always worked better for me and the people that I work with. And the track record is pretty good, but the track record for what I see the most is not so good on average. So having the forum, useful thing, but try to make sure that if you're going to make major decisions and so forth, or if you're just going to talk about tech, that there's actually something useful to talk about. On the topic of like making decisions, before you do it by yourself, you should to collaborate with your fellow coworkers. I think that what should be the norm, you should not be, this is just me talking now, but it is really weird if you have a meeting and that is the only reason you have the thought, maybe I should share this with my coworkers. So my rule of thumb, and I think that this should be a universal standard for literally every single person who's working in software development and probably beyond, is to ask the question, before you make any change to the code base, ask the question, the change I'm now introducing, will it affect people outside of myself? Is the scope of the thing that I'm doing now going to have an effect on other teams, or is it going to change somebody's workflow? Am I changing something that people have right now a picture of working in a certain way? Am I now introducing quote-unquote a breaking change? And that doesn't have to be to like a feature in the code base. It can be to a tool that you're using just locally for debugging. It can be a new practice. It can be anything. If you are introducing something that is non-standard or a new thing, you should stop and communicate every single time, regardless of what it is. It doesn't matter what it is. And if that doesn't happen naturally, organically in your brain, that is a problem, and you should address that, and everybody should address that within themselves. And then if that doesn't happen, that's something that is like literally the thing that the manager should really look into. That's the sort of thing, that's the behavior you really want. Because now you have a much more organic conversation going between the developers. You're actually creating collaboration, because people are now not looking at themselves as an individual that is just doing their thing. They're actually looking at themselves as a part of a community there where your decisions affect other people. That's a very, very useful thing. So doing that, I would say, is this thing that you should strive towards. But then you have this other part to the whole thing, which is that like if you're making decisions and so forth, yeah, collaboration and including people in the decision-making process, especially through code reviews and similar sorts of things, are very useful. But I think that there is one thing that is much more important in order for this to work, because like this thing I just mentioned, this is like the bull. This is what you should focus on if you can't do anything else. But you also have to find a consensus of values within the group. And I am the first person to raise my hand and say that on average, value words and all this bullshit is bullshit. It's always bullshit. It continues being bullshit. It's something that sounds really good in a middle management meeting. It's something that very rarely actually cascades down to the people doing the work, unless those value words actually mean something to the people, like they actually agree. And I find that much more organic and natural for people to decide on a few practices and things that everybody's kind of expected to fall behind, rather than have this like doctrine of commandments that says that we are caring, we are this, we are that. It's like, yeah, if you this has never failed, not a single time. Those value words, and I'm sorry to say that I've been in hour-long meetings trying to formulate them. Nobody can name them the week after, like all of them. Like even if you just have 4, they can't remember them. They can't say them. So there you are. Complete, like at least in my opinion, complete bullshit. But what is useful is for you and your fellow coworkers to get together and say, this is how we want to work. These are the things we would like to optimize for. An example would be, we want our workflow to be as effective as possible all the time, which means that for us, that means, I don't know, having the simplest tooling or standardizing on stable technology, or maybe you want to be extremely experimental, etc., etc. Talk amongst each other and get a sensation of what everybody cares about, and then get a consensus. It doesn't have to even be written down on paper. It's good if it is, but just get the consensus of what are we trying to achieve here together? What is our common goal? What is the common thing we're trying to go for? So that if, for example, one person wants to run wants to do functional programming or do something like that, hear them out, and say that everybody else wants to be object oriented. Hear them out, have a discussion, and find a consensus. Sometimes you have to agree to disagree, but at the very least have the discussion so that you align people on a holistic idea of what you are all trying to achieve with the work that you are doing. That is one of the most important things that you can do. So, what I want you to take away from this is that it's great to have syncs. It's great to have forums where you can discuss code and decision-making processes and stuff like that. I recommend that you have a weekly or bi-weekly meeting where, with any department, like if it's design and engineering, engineering QA, engineering PO, it doesn't really matter. Knowledge sharing is always a good thing. And then make that a very clear objective with that meeting, that it's a booked meeting, but it is optional. And it's not optional for people to attend, but it is optional if nobody has anything to share. Don't waste people's time with talking about like fluffy things that doesn't really jump off the page. It doesn't really matter to anybody, because then you trust me, if you want to sit in meetings all day, you can, and there are many companies that do. The thing that you should focus on is to arrive at a state of mind for all the people that you are working with, where whenever they make a change, they think in terms of breaking changes or breaking the workflow for somebody. It's not just about production code and APIs and contracts and interfaces here. It is about changing something that is expected by somebody else to work in a certain way. Before you even do that, you should send out a Slack message or a question or like whatever, or make a proof of concept and put up a pull request, something like that, and ask, does this make sense? Everybody should be doing that. And lastly, make sure that you all get together and have a talk about what are the things that we care about in this code base. Is performance important to us? Is stability important to us? Etc., etc. And then just talk it out so that you know where everybody stands on different topics, and then align on what direction you want the code base to go in. I'm not talking about features here. I'm just talking about, do we want to use Jest versus Mocha? Do we use, I don't know, Java or C#? Like, it doesn't have to be at that scale. It can be anything. Just to hash out how you want to work. What type of Git branching strategy do you want to use, etc., etc. And then write it down if it makes sense. Otherwise, just make sure that everybody's on the same page. Have a great day.